you wondering what's going on with international adoptions? We're hearing some scary things lately about new rules and fees. It sounds like the US government is adding more regulations and fees to make it even harder and more expensive for adoption agencies to do their jobs. What is really going on? Let's take a step back for a minute and try to get some context. Since 2006, the Council on Accreditation, COA, has served as a national accrediting entity authorized by the U.S. Department of State to provide Hague accreditation and approval for adoption agencies. This status indicates that the agency conducts its services in substantial compliance with the standards founded in the Hague Convention, the Intercountry Adoption Act, and the Universal Accreditation Act, and that COA was monitoring and overseeing its conduct. Families trusted that accredited agencies were working in ethical and legal ways. Unfortunately, that has not always proven to be true. Consider Vietnam. In 2005, the United States signed a 3-year bilateral agreement with Vietnam, complete with safeguards against corruption. Between 2006 and 2009, Americans adopted 2,220 children from Vietnam. Sadly, from the first moment adoptions restarted, there were problems. The U.S. Embassy in Hanoi noticed a suspicious uptick in abandoned infants in orphanages that had contracts with international adoption agencies. Vietnamese women reported being lied to by hospital and other officials and their babies taken for adoptions. Paperwork was changed to erase children's histories and marked abandoned. Numerous orphanages and American agencies were implicated in the fraud and corruption. By the end of 2008, the United States government had no choice but to let the agreement expire and adoptions shut down. Consider Guatemala. In 2006 and 2007, Guatemala sent almost as many children to the United States for adoption as China, a country which has 100 times as many people. Despite many protections required, such as DNA testing of a birth parent and the relinquished child, the UN and other investigators found widespread child buying, coercion, and kidnapping of children for adoption. In 2008, the United States could find no other option but to close the door to adoptions from Guatemala. Consider Ethiopia. A total of 15,317 children were adopted between 1999 and 2016. The United States Embassy received numerous reports of fraud and corruption. Various problems, such as adoption agencies charging orphanage fees for referrals, which was illegal under Ethiopian law, orphanages promising to pay birth parents for their children, and orphanages and agencies colluding to falsify children's documents in order to circumvent Ethiopian and American adoption laws. In 2017, it was Ethiopia that took the step to shut down all adoptions. Quote, amid concerns that overseas adoptions fuel a trade in children from poor families and put them at risk of abuse or being trafficked into slave-like conditions, Parliament passed legislation on January 10th banning inter-country adoption. And then there's Uganda, a small program where up until 2011 there were just over 50 adoptions a year. Then in recent years there was a 5-fold increase as other sources for adoption dried up. European Adoption Consultants, EAC, was an agency that had placed more than 2,000 children from more than a dozen countries, including Uganda. Last year, multiple families working with EAC discovered that their children were placed without the birth mother's knowledge or consent. In fact, the orphanage that EAC worked exclusively with in Uganda was shut down due to trafficking of children, operating the children's home illegally, and processing guardianship orders fraudulently. In December 2016, EAC was debarred by the State Department, leaving 300 in-process families scrambling to find another way to complete their adoptions. These are just a few examples of the countries and programs that have shut down because of corruption and fraud. Since 2006, significant adoption programs have shuttered and the numbers of adoptions has plummeted. How could this happen? Wasn't COA watching over the agencies to prevent such fraud and corruption? Yes and no. As the head of COA, Richard Klarberg testified before Congress in 2006. He said, "At COA, we view accreditation as a strategy that providers can employ to strengthen, measure, and validate their credibility, integrity, and organizational effectiveness." The essential characteristics of COA accreditation are the use of volunteer surveyors and organizational self-evaluation, and a process that emphasizes working with candidates in a collegial and facilitative manner. With only 4 full-time employees and most of the investigations handled by volunteers from inside the adoption industry, COA was apparently counting on agencies to police themselves. The flaws in this strategy became overwhelmingly obvious in the EAC case in Uganda, but in fact, COA had to be forced by the State Department to take action. Despite an abundance of evidence to the contrary, just a few months before they were disbarred, EAC was re-accredited by COA, which leaves us asking, who is watching out for families and children? It has become obvious that something had to change. A number of foreign countries have publicly stated that they will not start or reopen adoption programs so long as the United States continues to let their agencies flaunt the laws. So now, the Office of Children's Issues at the State Department is doing all they can to repair the damage to America's credibility overseas. They told COA it was time to step up their monitoring and oversight of agencies. COA refused. So Children's Issues found a new accrediting entity willing to take on the task: Intercountry Adoption Accreditation and Maintenance Entity, IAME. With 20 full-time employees who are trained and can give a consistent level of oversight to all agencies, IAME will be equipped to provide the increased monitoring and oversight that is needed. 20 employees cost more than 4 employees, so there is a new $500 fee for each family to cover the costs. That is only a 1.4% increase to the cost of the average adoption. In return, the potential benefits of these changes to the system cannot be overstated. Agencies will no longer be able to throw up their hands and say, "We didn't know," when bad things are done in their name and for their profit. Adoption traffickers will be put out of business. Children could be saved from being trafficked. Vulnerable families protected. Adoptive families saved from heartache. Countries that previously have refused to reopen or to start a program may be willing to do so, and as a result, adoptions will likely increase. And yet, agencies are in a panic, exaggerating costs, putting out ads, calling their friends in the press, pressuring families to sign petitions and call their congressmen, even personal attacks against those in charge of making regulations for adoptions. Anything they can think of to stop these changes from happening. Why? Is it possible we have lost perspective? At the end of the day, let's remember who this is really about. Protecting the most vulnerable is the very heart of adoption. Now is not the time for panic, but for hope. It may be that the best days for adoptions are yet to come.